Goodbye 2020. Obviously, it's been an incredibly tough year for so many people, and I actually thought this year kind of showed the importance of video games in a weird way. I think that staying inside my flat, hanging out with people online, has actually made 2020 a lot better than it otherwise would have been. It kind of showed the strength of the hobby in a weird way, being able to connect people digitally, which I think has just been so important in 2020. So, goodbye 2020, but I'd also say well done video games. I think it's been a really strong year in that sense. As you can see here, this game, Carto, unfortunately didn't quite make my top 10. Definitely worth checking out. Really unusual puzzler, some cool sort of jigsaw mechanics in there, a bit like Carcass on the board game. Definitely worth checking out. It kind of went under people's radar, but you don't want to hear about Carto. You want to hear about the top 10 games of the year. So let's get to that list. Number 10, Star Wars Squadrons. I should start by saying my only experience of this game is playing through the story mode in VR on my PlayStation 4. But honestly, that 7 to 8 hour campaign was all I needed to be convinced that Squadrons had to fly into this top 10. Having traditionally loved the Factor 5 Star Wars games, including Rogue Squadron and Battle for Naboo, Squadrons provides a bit of a change with no third person mode and playing in first person or VR. If you followed video games in the last 4 years, then you've already listened to and might be sick to death of people telling you how immersive and incredible VR is. But if there's an experience that gets VR just right, it is being able to sit inside the cockpit and fly everything from an X-Wing, an A-Wing, a Y-Wing, a U-Wing, a TIE Fighter, a TIE Interceptor, a TIE Reaper, and even a TIE Bomber. Every ship feels so distinct in terms of the way they fly and the array of weapons they have. Every single time I sat in a new ship, I had to spend a good 30 seconds just looking around the cockpit and taking in all the minute details that are different to each craft. For example, the TIE Bomber has rows of benches for stormtroopers to sit in behind the cockpit if you look behind. It's a dumb little thing to focus on, but it's one of those things that gives a sense of place to each cockpit you sit in that only VR can fully achieve. I've got to give credit to EA that they do the details really well with their Star Wars license. Stuff like sound design, music, and replicating key things that make Star Wars feel like Star Wars are all here in this game. And actually the story's not bad either. Obviously swapping between Empire and New Republic sides allows you to fly more ships, which seems like the whole point of the two-sided story, but it actually works quite nicely. If you have VR and any interest in Star Wars, this game is a must play. A bit like the Empire, it is feeling a bit like VR is fading away in the next few years, but let's hope it can return like the First Order and make some big waves in the future. Number 9, Ghost of Tsushima. I absolutely love the best aspects of Ghost of Tsushima. The combat system is top tier, and I must admit, as such a big fan of Japan, I was sucker punched into loving the game's setting. I also really enjoyed Tsushima's plot. The themes around honor and the way Bushido is intrinsically linked to Jin's relationship to his uncle creates a well-delivered story, whereas the revenge against the Mongols and the Khan is basically side dressing. It actually works really well for me. I felt the combat system blended perfectly with the plot, as Jin's relationship with his uncle and attitudes to honor in combat change and evolve throughout the game as Jin learns to become the Ghost. Taking on hordes of Mongols, quote unquote, with honor, quickly becomes very hard work in the early game, and you feel tempted to utilize the methods of the Ghost. But this game also has an abundance of side characters that fit in nicely to the overall plot, while each having their own stories and chapters for Jin to help them with. Most missions are some fairly simple open world level design, but it's executed so well that it kept me coming back for more. The beautiful setting of Tsushima and the incredible feeling of combat were the two main drivers that made me want to see everything the game has to offer. Shoutouts to bamboo stacks, where you have to press button combinations to cut your blade through in a single strike, one of the most satisfying collectibles of the year. Tsushima doesn't go far from the traditional model of open world games, and of those ones that I've played, it is easily my favourite. Sucker Punch definitely delivered a Sony first party layer of quality with this game and have set out a world that is as beautiful as it is brutal. Number 8, The Pathless. My favourite game of all time, Breath of the Wild, taught me about the aspects of open world games I enjoy the most, traversal and discovery. Now sure, Breath of the Wild has plenty of collectibles, combat encounters, the shrines themselves and other things to do in between, but otherwise it's still a pretty lean experience, especially when compared to more traditional open world games. But what if you took traversal and discovery with some puzzles and a handful of boss fights and made that the entire game? The Pathless almost delivers perfectly on the stream. Simple ideas like completely removing a health bar or the ability to take damage means you're never thinking about smashing pots for health or trading in items for upgrades. In fact, even when you get hit by a boss, you get booted out of the battle arena and don't actually take any damage. You can simply step back into the ring. It's some really nice checkpointing that would otherwise take much more time. Having no map in the Pathless forces you to reach higher ground and use your senses to seek out the light stones required to progress the game, forcing you to reach points you can see in the game world rather than opening up a map again really reinforces the game's push to get the player to explore and discover the world. The only upgrade you can improve in this game is the number of times your eagle can gain elevation while gliding. This one power up in itself feels like it has come straight out of Breath of the Wild. Finding small puzzles in the world can give you more crystals to fill out your bar and gain a new level of elevation every time the bar is maxed out. Everything you do in this game serves to improve your ability to traverse the world and advance the story, nothing else. It's simple, but it works incredibly well. The game does this cool thing where every area you reach is on a new raised open world plateau, meaning that you can always look down behind you at the plateau you have previously been on. Not only does it give an incredible sense of scale to the world as you progress, but it also hides the later plateaus you haven't reached yet, leaving more surprise for later. Like all good open world games, I felt compelled to go and get everything in this game. That feeling is always strengthened when the game has progressively upgraded your means to traverse the world throughout, making collecting everything even easier and more fun. Combined with a jaw-droppingly stunning setting, I really wanted to spend more time in this world. The Pathless proves that often less is more when it comes to game design, especially in an open world setting. It's definitely a game that has wrongly, in my view, gone under a lot of people's radar, so I implore you, go play this game. Number 7. Final Fantasy VII Remake. I am very fussy when it comes to JRPGs. When I know I'm going to be investing 35 plus hours into a game, I need the game to deliver on story or battle mechanics, or preferably both, in a big way. I'm very glad to say that Final Fantasy VII Remake delivers on both. Luckily for me, the demo to Final Fantasy VII Remake completely sold me on the battle mechanics. Blending turn-based actions with live combat is done to perfection. As characters' bars charge to unleash moves, you find yourself always having something to do, using close combat, range attacks and magic, each at the perfect moment to take enemies down. I also have a fear of incredibly tough, unbeatable bosses in JRPGs that can really suck the fun right out of an experience, in particular looking at you, Square Enix. I was so pleased to see that in a 40-hour game like Final Fantasy VII Remake, there was only one boss I would have classified as unfair, that felt like a slog to get through. As someone new to the world of Final Fantasy VII Remake's story about a radical environmental group taking down a big planet-destroying corporation, it was a story I could really totally get behind. The struggles the group goes through to weigh up how radical they want to be at each stage of the journey, given the risks involved, and Cloud's role in the process, made for an incredibly compelling story driven on by characters that I really ended up caring about. And what a glorious world this game takes place in. The surface of the plate looks like a genuine lived-in world and is almost a Japanese take on Art Deco French architecture with an extra dose of steampunk for good measure. Midgar really is a sight to behold. Underneath the plate there's a whole other world that feels lived in and real, while the spectre of Shinra HQ and Wall Market are maybe the two standout areas of the game. Sure, I definitely would like to play the original game, but for someone with no knowledge of Final Fantasy VII other than the fact that Cloud is an anime boy with a sword, this game set the scene incredibly well. It may have taken a decade to get here, but boy did this game live up to that hype in my eyes. Here's to part 2, which I look forward to playing in the year 2030. Number 6. Spiritfarer. When Spiritfarer was first shown at Xbox's 2019 E3 presentation, the art style really appealed to me, but it really wasn't clear mechanically what the game was all about. When I found out the game was taking management sim Stardew Valley farming mechanics, Wind Waker island traversal, and some Night in the Woods style platforming melded with character dialogue, I knew Spiritfarer was a game I had to experience. I'm pleased to say this game surpassed even that blockbuster description. First, can we shout out how awesome hugging is in this game? Moving around your boat and saying good morning to characters through a hug, complete with some of the best animations of the year, is a heartwarming experience in a year where 2020 has stopped us from hugging friends, family and loved ones. Some characters such as Alice and Gwen's stories really hit me in the gut when you find out more about their background, or Astra's trade union actions in her life, complete with discovering her at an industrial shipport. Her distaste of the fancier echelons of society is even reflected in her dislike for fancy food. Some of the best aspects of the game are the really cool smaller mechanical stuff that reflects the personalities of the characters on board your ship. Suburban cities, Japanese countryside and Parisian markets are all represented in some incredible island locations. I really never got bored of sailing around, backtracking and discovering new areas. The mechanics of the gaming loop and the presentation of the locations was just so strong that the 25 to 30 hours I spent with this game just flew by like I was playing a few days in Stardew Valley. Stella and her cat Daffodil have some of the best animations of the year and can make the repetitive nature of managing all your resources and processing goods so much more fun. This game really is bursting with charm and brought warmth with some hard-hitting personal stories that I thought actually put some things into perspective. Knowing that Thunder Lotus based these characters in Spiritfarer on real friends and family that have passed on only makes this game hit even harder. It's not a game to be missed. This game certainly wins my award for comfiest, coziest and most chill game of the year. And in a year like 2020, maybe that's the award that actually matters the most. Number 5. Astros Playroom. In true review embargo spirit, I'm not going to show levels outside of the first level, Cooling Springs, or mention anything beyond the first level, because one of the most charming things about Astros Playroom is discovering all the cool collectibles and abilities this game has to offer. Honestly, if you've not picked up a PS5 at this point, it's definitely worth trying to go into this stuff as blind as possible. I adored Astrobot Rescue Mission in 2018, and it's probably my favourite VR game of all time. But honestly, Playroom feels like a very different game. There's hardly any linearity to the levels here in Playroom in comparison, and the sheer amount of Sony fan service lathered all over the game is hard not to warm to. In a weird way, this is actually the most Nintendo game on this list. I know it's hard to believe for a game with so much Sony fan service, but the way it treats Sony's history combined with some fun exploration-based platforming that is so focused around discovery makes the game feel a lot like Mario Odyssey, Super Smash Bros. And Nintendo Land merged into one game. That moment every time Astro gets in a new suit and completely changes the gameplay utilizing the DualSense made me feel the way I did every time Mario would go into a new chapter in Odyssey. It completely changes up gameplay in an incredible way. The DualSense is a bit like the new VR. You simply have to experience it. Videos, podcasts and column inches of people saying how awesome it is simply isn't a fair representation of describing how it feels. The best description I can come up with is trying to imagine Rumble and a standard controller divided up into about 10 different motors across different parts of the gamepad, and then turn that up to 11. All these different motors acting in sync with what Astro is doing on screen to represent even the surface that Astro is walking on is an incredible feature. I genuinely hope it can continue in games going into the future, even at least for Sony's first parties. Having only picked up a PS4 in 2018, I wasn't so sure Playroom would be for me with its detailed look back at the minutiae of all things relating to PlayStation hardware, as well as software. But even with my fairly limited experience of Sony history, the Sony fan service is the second best thing about this game after the utilization of the DualSense for me. Little groups of Astrobots replicating little dioramas in the world with representation from every single Sony first party game under the sun is awesome. On the face of it, it's such a simple, dumb little thing, but as you keep progressing through the game, working out who's who, you realise just how awesome it is to see. It's been said about companies like Disney and Nintendo that they just get all the little things right. The attention to detail shows how much they care about their projects. That's exactly how I felt playing Astros Playroom. It may not be a long game, and I think had it been longer with more collectibles and suits for Astro to experience, this game could have been even higher on this list. But it is genius of Sony to include this 4 to 5 hour experience as a pack-in. I like that Sony have cemented Astro as the mascot of PlayStation 5. I really hope they do more platformers with him in the near future. In a world where many other Sony first parties stick to narrative-driven cinematic experiences, the Nintendo-influenced mascot platformer feels like a breath of fresh air. Long may he continue. Number 4. Hades. What more can be said about this game? As someone who doesn't really play a ton of roguelikes and doesn't really play dungeon crawling loot-based games, I was completely blown away by Hades. Dying in games and restarting over again traditionally doesn't massively appeal to me. Even in other roguelikes I've played, often the first thing I want to do when I fail a run is to put the game down and have a break. But that was almost impossible to do with Hades. Experimenting with boons, meeting new characters, discovering a new mini-boss that kicks your ass, replaying bosses over and over until you beat them without barely breaking a sweat, getting to a new end of biome boss only for them to kick your ass for the 10th time. There's just so much to experience the more runs that you do. And what makes it all the more sweet is the nice, comfortable, systematic progression of the darkness. I'm sure without darkness I would have eventually beaten the game through muscle memory and learning inside out each boss and biome, but the added bonuses of the darkness and spending it on upgrades makes the whole process feel a lot smoother. Combining my improved muscle memory skills with mechanically boosted stats like health, for example, make you feel like you always have a fighting chance to improve on your last run. Seeing online how others play the game was fascinating. I generally preferred very defensive turtle style, punishing enemies at range, but others would do the complete opposite and charge through enemies using dashing and slashing. I love that there are so many different ways to play the game that feel so finely balanced. The ancient Greek setting feels super fresh, and the idea of Zagreus repeatedly dying and returning to the underworld might be one of the most perfect thematic settings for a roguelike where you are constantly dying and starting over. I'm proud to say I managed to beat the game 10 times to see credits, but whether you're here for the short term or the long haul, Hades has an ungodly amount of content to offer anyone on so many different levels. Number 3. Spider-Man Miles Morales. Spider-Man 2018 was my perfect cup of tea when it comes to games. Incredible traversal around a tight open world with some very solid combat and a cinematic story and characters which far surpassed my expectations for a Marvel superhero romp. Spider-Man Miles Morales takes out some of the weaker aspects of the first game like Mary Jane's stealth missions and random science puzzles, making the game already feel leaner and stronger. I didn't mind the length of the first game, but Miles Morales definitely packs it more of a punch with its 3 to 4 hour story. Of course, I was having such a great time with this game, going after trophies and getting golds and all the challenges, that I eventually spent around 18 hours with this game. The incredible level of detail applied to certain areas of the world, such as Harlem, and the new setting of New York in winter, meant the game world actually felt surprisingly fresh compared to 2018's distinctly autumnal setting. Miles and the characters around him feel like much more of a unit than the range of characters from the first game. I found myself caring a lot more about each of the relationships Miles has with other characters around him, and a lot of ground is actually covered for such a brief story. It's certainly progress to see reference to Black Lives Matter in such a high profile game, and full credit to Insomniac for doing so. Perhaps BLM protests were too late in the development cycle to be included more meaningfully in the game. Maybe this is a theme that could be tackled more elegantly in the future, especially given Spider-Man's relationship with the police and the fact that Miles' late father was a police officer and that his mother is a politician. I'll admit I played on PlayStation 5 and honestly can't get away from the fact that this was my first ever 60 frames per second experience in glorious 4K resolution. For a game with such impressive lighting and animations, particularly in combat, it is so far visually the most impressive thing I've seen in gaming. I could play a Spider-Man game set in this world every year if Insomniac wanted, so I can't wait to see what happens to these characters and where this world goes next. 2 Spider-Men and Spider-Man 2 could be what takes this series to the next level. Number 2. The Last of Us Part 2. Naughty Dog could have made a pretty solid, standard, interesting yet rote sequel to The Last of Us. I and many others who loved the first game would probably also be pretty big fans, but while Last of Us Part 2 still harkens back to some of the best aspects from the first game, the wider bold decisions the game takes makes this game feel very, very different, and yes, I absolutely love the bold decisions this game takes. I love that so many characters, each with their own relationships, loyalties and diverse backgrounds, are brought into this horrifying world. I love that meaningful, well-delivered resolutions are brought to some of the question marks left at the end of the first game, while creating so many more new plot points that drive the complexity of the world up a notch. I personally love the world building this game delivers on. For this game to introduce new factions in the dense city of Seattle creates my ideal setting as to how religion, politics and society would interplay in a zombie apocalypse. I particularly love the way that a new river running right through the heart of Seattle turns the Space Needle into an island and forces one of the factions to settle high up in empty skyscrapers. There are also so many combinations of characters that you end up playing through different sections of the game with. The short bits of dialogue between characters outside of cutscenes are some of my absolute favourite parts of writing in Naughty Dog games. Often it was those conversations that were driving me through some of the otherwise horrifying periods of gameplay. I can't emphasize enough how much I hate things related to horror. I simply can't handle it. It's a testament to how compelling and involved I felt with the characters of Last of Us Part 2 that made me want to keep going in what was otherwise often a horrifying world to be in. While there are long stretches that are brutal and challenging both from a psychological perspective and a pure gameplay one, I found that the moments of peace and calm in Seattle, especially in daylight, were some of the most beautiful things I've seen in video games. In many senses, this is still a Sony first-party cinematic narrative-driven third-person game that we are all very used to at this stage, but this is perhaps the one that drives that specific genre on the most in the last console generation. This game shows that Naughty Dog are still the kings of cinematic storytelling and game design, and long may that continue. Number 1. Ori and the Will of the Wisps. Pure Metroidvania perfection. I'm a big fan of many Metroidvanias, but there are none that beat Will of the Wisps for its setting, mechanics, art, music, and even characters. Will of the Wisps is an incredibly wise and mature sequel to what Blind Forest was, and fundamentally feels like a very different game. Introducing a new combat system with different weapons. Yes, I loved this game after about 20 minutes when Ori started carving up enemies with a lightsaber, but also introducing bosses that add a sense of place and depth to the characters and world around Ori adds so much to this game. Ori now not only has an arsenal of different weapons to specialise in and upgrade, but a host of new movement options. While escape sequences are considerably easier than the first game, I felt much more invested in the moveset in Will of the Wisps. Combining all the powers together, especially by the end of the game, meant I would sometimes be using in excess of 5 different powers in quick succession to traverse the gorgeous world. Speaking of gorgeous world, the water in Blind Forest was one of the artistic highlights of that game, and it's like Moon Studios knew they were onto a winner with their water, because Luma Pools in Will of the Wisps might be the most beautiful setting in any game, and is easily the best water area of any game when it comes to movement and discovery. Metroidvanias don't normally focus too much on narrative, but I felt Ori goes the extra mile in building up the villain in this game and understanding their backstory. There are some powerful but simple themes around exclusion, longing and sorrow that certainly packed a lot more of a punch than I was expecting. And that slightly darker story is reinforced by one particularly dark area of this game, which I thought actually felt quite fresh in a world where otherwise you zip around so fast. It's cool to have an area where you have to stop and be considered about the infested, horrifying darkness around Ori that crescendos with an equally horrifying boss fight. Gareth Coker deserves huge praise for what is one of my favourite soundtracks in the whole of video games. Will of the Wisps has its own distinct themes while still playing with the melodies from the first game. With such a diversity of lands for Ori to visit in Will of the Wisps, Coker's soundtrack reinforces the sense of place with these new settings as the music evokes everything from levity to sorrow where appropriate. It is a truly cinematic level of production, which is rare to come by when it comes to Metroidvanias. I don't often come back to games, but I can definitely see myself coming back to this one. Nintendo, look what happens when you don't make Metroidvanias. Not only has the Metroidvania hole been filled with a plethora of quality Metroidvanias, but now one has come along which I don't think even you will be able to surpass. Good job. I bought an Xbox One S for this game and it did not disappoint. I think the industry will be hard pushed to find a stronger game in this genre for quite some time to come, even if Nintendo remembers what Metroidvanias are. Will of the Wisps is an incredibly special experience and it's easily one of my favourite games of all time. Well, there you have it. Another year comes to a close. And, I thought it was a very strong year, actually. I thought it was a pretty strong list I put out. That's now the third time I've done a cross-platform top 10 games of the year video, and it was a lot of fun to put together. I would love for this to continue going into the future. I'd love to make one in 2021. Should shout out Carrion that you can see right now. It's another game that didn't quite make my list, but was kind of off my radar. Had a really great time playing that game on Game Pass, and yeah, it's cool. It's like, let's flip horror on its head. You can do all the horrifying. That's kind of the way I think I like it. Having played some scary games this year, it might be nice to play as the monster, not the victim, perhaps. But yeah, and thanks to 2020, and thanks to everyone who listens to the podcast and the podcast community over on Discord. I think it's just been a really great year in terms of connecting and people coming together, and I'm really enjoying the podcast. Long may it continue. I think there's lots to look forward to in 2021 in the world of video games, and you bet me and MBZ are going to cover it all. So yeah, look forward to that. Happy New Year, and I'll see you all in 2021. Goodbye.